Hello everyone, I'm Jonathan, also known as the Medieval Genie, and this time it's another wish being granted, and we're talking about the Seax knives. Now, we should pretty much get started on the terminology. When we talk about the Seax knife, of course we're doing a very modern thing, which I heard is a bit of a Victorian thing, which then, sort of built up from there. But regardless of when it started, I'm not 100% sure on these things. We have, as a modern society, started with this kind of classification and categorization, probably to help with things like archaeology and history. So you hear about things like the gladius and things like the longsword and things like the Seax, and these are modern terms when actually a word like gladius does not mean a specific type of sword, it means sword. So then we are having a look at this, which is a classic this is what people in a more modern period will sort of call a Seax type of knife, something that has the point tapering forwards, single-edged, straight-bladed. I mean, this one's a bit wobbly because this was one of my very first attempts at a knife, so this was a crude thing I made ages ago, but it still has a rough idea of what it should be. Single-edged, like I said, fairly stocky spine, gradually tapering towards the edge, unlike some blades which kind of have a flat section and then get a bit of a wedge, almost like certain axes and things. And then, so this one curls towards the tip, but on the, what we call Seax design, it actually tends to be a straight line, so it just goes, fairly similar breadth all the way along, not usually much of a gradual taper, and then suddenly it sort of suddenly triangulates. And on some blades, if this was the edge, you would have the sort of edge going back, and you see this sort of thing on certain designs of knives, and then that would be where it curls back, which I think helps to facilitate some cutting actions, that drawing motion. And also when you're thrusting, you're kind of able to look along down the spine at what you're thrusting at, whereas with this, the point, because it tapers forwards to the point on the what we call Seax design, notice what I'm doing there, it tapers forwards so the point is in line with the edge. This is a personal choice thing. It can work either way. Some people would prefer it to have an edge curl back into a point. Some people would want it to curl forwards, or some people would want something like this kind of spear tip going on, where it sort of meets in the middle. There is no real advantage or disadvantage, so I'm not going to let anyone say that's a technological advancement or regression. It's crap. It just is what people want. So anyway, so when you look at the Seax, so I said that gladius just means sword. Now the word Seax just means knife. The point I'm coming to here is that when we start talking about Broadseax, Langseax and Scramasax and all these things that you've probably heard, if you did the search in a bar and found this video, you've heard at least once one of those sorts of terms. However, they're modern. So this is a Seax, which is a knife, which also means, as people would disagree if I just suddenly walked up and said this hunting knife I've got is a Seax. Additionally, this folding knife with something like a 1-inch blade is a Seax. Now, if you went into something like Forged in Fire or some other place where they were wanting historical authenticity and all that, and if I walked up and said this is a Seax, they'd go, no it isn't. But, like I said, if we distill all of these ideas of this modern categorization, this is a knife. Translation, Seax. And so is this. And so is this. They're all knives. This is where it starts to become a problem with things like the Broadseax and a Langseax. Oh, and apologies if you're hearing explosive noises outside, by the way. I'm not in some suspiciously grassy and middle-class version of Afghanistan. There's a bit of thunder going on. So anyway, now back to what I was saying. With the Broadseax and the Langseax, people would typically think of this. This is something that a modern person would call a Langseax. So it's the same sort of thing again. Tapers towards a point which is in line with the edge. I'll show you closer up. So this is the edge. So with that, a fairly thick spine, gradually tapering towards the edge, and of course that straight blade. And this, of course, this is much further on in my progression in blacksmithing, even though I'm still an amateur, so you get the proper idea of a real straight blade, which is contrasted with certain Eastern European and Asian weapons which tended to lean towards curvature. You also see it in Middle Eastern weapons. When you look at European weapons, they tend to usually be straight bladed. Again, this is not an advantage or disadvantage or anything superior or inferior in technology. It is more a cultural thing and a matter of personal choice. So anyway, with this sort of Langseax, I could call it that in a modern sense and that modern context to help differentiate it from other types of sax, like this, which of course is more like a knife. It's got, I think it's a 12-inch blade, whereas this is a sword and it's got, I think, a 20-inch blade. So of course I'm sort of using that to help other modern people. But if you went back then, I mean, Langseax, it just means a long knife. It's very similar to when you look at the Messer in some German sources of fencing. So you're looking at, that's a bit later in the medieval period. Things like the sax that we talk about in modern times, we're tending to talk about the early medieval period or migration era. So we're talking maybe a few hundred AD up to about maybe 1100, 1200 AD-ish. Whereas things like Messer, you can see styles where people are actually wearing slightly more advanced armour, and that's talking maybe 1300s, 1400s or later. There's no, there's a lot of blurred lines in these things. So a design like this could continue past the early medieval period, but there'd be a lot less of it. There's no sudden stop, and you just say, here are these brilliant swords, oh I love them, everyone has them, we stop using them. Real life doesn't work like that. It tends to be more of a gradual process. So anyway, with this sort of Langseax, the typical characteristics of this are the fact that, apart from that forward taper to the point and the straight bladedness, it means that it is often a cheaper form of sword, and it does, I think it does help show that in the terminology. So with this being called, let's translate it to English for you all, a long knife, it's that attitude, so that suggests to me that it would be more commonly available. So if I wanted a sword, because it's a great backup weapon, using spears, it might break, it might go dull, you might decide you want to throw it at someone like a javelin. There are all sorts of scenarios where you might not be able to find your spear, or you might not have it, or it might break, all this stuff. So having an extra large weapon is handy, as opposed to just suddenly resorting to a short knife and hoping for the best. So with this sort of blade, it's useful, which is in comparison to things like your sort of Saxon Viking style swords, which were available in the migration period and the early medieval period. Those sorts of swords tended to be double-edged. So I've got this, which is not of any particular historical design, but it does have a similar blade. This is another one I made. So this sort of, I was impersonating kind of a spath, or maybe an early medieval sword in a generic sense. But this does give you a good idea of what you're talking about. So fairly broad bladed, double-edged, and it would either have a spine like this, or it would have fullering in it. That depends. But with these types of swords, they tended to have a short crossguard and a pommel, which is something also to note in that crossguards are often called cruciform hilts, suggesting that they are Christian. However, that cruciform hilt appears on non-Christian cultures of swords. So you see them including with, you know, the Nordic peoples who were, up to a certain point, mostly non-Christian and didn't really care about that sort of symbology. So you're seeing those crossguards, and I'm not aware of crossguards appearing on things like the Langseax, as in a knife type of sword, which is interesting. So it seems like you're looking at more expensive and more affordable forms of sword. So when you're talking about what they're calling a sword, it would be kind of like perhaps the comparison between a bolt-action rifle and an assault rifle sort of thing. I mean, that's the best comparison I can think of for modern times, but you've got something that's in a way similar, but there are clear advantages to the more advanced version. So with the sword, what they're actually calling I think it's a schwert or a sword, something like that. With what they're calling sword in those times, we're more talking about double-edged blades, a more of a spear type of point, potentially some fluorine or a spine going on, natural to a double-edged sword, pommel, crossguard, also potentially more ornate sort of, you know, engravings, very decorated hilts, and those sorts of features. But again, it's not really a hard barrier. There's no particular distinction other than mostly your blade types, because you do also see very ornate versions of these long knives. You see versions with, what's it called? It's not engraving, inlay, that's the word. So I've seen some versions which have things like copper and silver, or, you know, gold, silver, copper, bronze, all sorts of materials like that. And they've actually basically sort of chiselled out little grooves and things into the blade. But unlike fullerene, they're not there to just serve as a functional purpose. They chisel them out quite shallowly, and then they inlay these bits of wire made of precious or semi-precious metals to then create a very decorative effect. And that's quite expensive. Even if you bought something of that design these days with modern machinery, it's going to cost quite a bit of money and dip into your savings. So back then, when it was all done by hand with lower technology, it would be even worse for affordability. So that suggests that you shouldn't ever think of the Langseax as a poor man's weapon. It can also be a rich person's weapon. And of course, there are advantages to a single-edged blade. I've always considered that there is a closeness between the Langseax and the Broadseax types of things, the sword-length knives, that make them a bit more like, say, a machete. So if I took this sword, the Langseax that I'm calling it, and I tried to cut a tree with it, I have a feeling it would survive the process better, and I'd feel it would be more suitable for the purpose than something like this. This is, to me, a sword. So this it's a very similar length. I think it's a 21-inch blade. This is a good cut and thrust blade. You can do your parry riposte actions, you can do draw cuts, you can do chopping actions, you can line up for thrusts, all of those things. And it works better because, and also you can do things like back edge cuts, which of course are not as powerful but have nice strategic advantages. Like, for example, following immediately after beating the opponent's weapon aside, so you not turn, chop. So that's one thing to bear in mind with something like a Langseax. If you did something like that beat, you'd need to turn the weapon, cut up. So it leans a little bit more towards being a tool than a sword. However, is still clearly a sword. So it would seem as though perhaps one of the reasons why richer people would have these as well as poorer people, besides a fashion choice, you know, it might actually look cool to have one of these you know, long knives, very well decorated and beautifully made, rather than having something so completely distinct like this. Same as how rich people in modern times will sometimes have trainers and, you know, hoodies and things like that, but very expensive brand name versions. You see common people wearing those same items, but you have an expensive, glamorized version to kind of make a more direct comparison. It may be a similar scenario for back then as well. Now that again is conjecture, because there are very few, if any, written sources that explain anything about why these things existed. All we know is the particular context in which these were used, and there are plenty of sources explaining these long knives being used to fight. So I can, without hesitation, say that these were used for battle as well as potentially for tool purposes. It's actually the tool purposes that are harder to find any information on. However, I mean, with our classifications, we're calling these a Langseax, and this a sax. So this is sword size, and this is knife size. But there are no hard limits. You know, not even talking about brand names and, you know, makes and models. It's just an individual smith making something. Essentially, every item ever created is custom made, even if they might follow a general pattern and repeat certain things they've done before. So then you need to start asking a question: when is it a knife and when is it a sword? Because it seems that this is still called a knife. It's a Langseax or a Broadseax. So by that idea, this is a knife and this is a knife. So I could have this is 12 inches, maybe it could be 13, 14, 15. So between this 20-inch blade and this 12-inch blade, when does it start being a sword and when does it stop being a knife? I don't think there are any hard limits for that. So I could take a blade like this, and I've seen longer versions. So this, you know, you can see versions maybe 24, 26-inch blade, and as they get longer, they become more clearly weapon designed. However, they can get shorter and shorter, and they can end up being more knife-sized. So you can go from a very tiny, maybe 3-inch blade sax, which is clearly just a knife. You can use it in self-defense, but it's a shorter reach, and it doesn't pierce as far. You know, if you find a soft point in the flesh, typically the further you can penetrate with the weapon, the better that it works. It's like how, I think it's about 3 inches into the chest, the upper left chest, that you need to reach the heart. So, of course, as you can imagine, if someone's wearing a few inches of clothing on top, then a 3-inch blade might not reach the heart. Now, the reason I'm saying this is because you can start gauging it further and further. So, with this, it's more heavily leaning towards being a weapon, but it could still be a tool. I'm confident that I could cut branches, I could whittle staves, I could do a lot of knife and machete tasks with this long knife. Additionally, I could use this shorter knife as a weapon, and in fact I've done some test cutting with it, and I mean, it's not as sharp as it could be, it doesn't thrust amazingly, but it still is functional, and that's mostly due to the quality of my construction rather than the actual size and shape. So this could be used as a weapon, this could be used as a tool. So in terms of the construction of the knife, it's hard to see any particular origins, because, I mean, you've got a lot of designs. If you look further back at Celtic and Roman designs, they tend to be double-edged. They tend to be more like this. Or if you're looking at something shorter, excuse me, here's a design. Again, this isn't following any specific pattern, but I was inspired by sort of Celtic swords. So I've got this, which, as you can see, is a shorter blade, but it's still double-edged. And I've looked at actual historical examples of Celtic swords and knives, and they seem to be more frequently double-edged, which would mean they can be used for combat, and it's it's quite nice because if it dulls on one edge, you can use the other edge. If you're thrusting into something, say gutting an animal or something, or fighting a person, two edges mean that as you're thrusting, it's sort of, the cutting power actually helps with puncturing in, but also extracting out. So even on things that are not necessarily being used as fighting knives, if you're needing to get into something and do some cutting, or perhaps pierce into something, double edge actually can still help you in a non-combat scenario, so that's handy. So it seems quite sudden that you're seeing these thicker spined single-edged blades sort of almost come out of nowhere. I'd wonder if maybe they were more Germanic influences, bearing in mind that the sources that you get for earlier periods, they tend to be very Roman or Greek. If you look at people like the Celts, you don't find written sources. If you look at things like the Germanic tribes, you don't find any sources. So for all we know, there could be versions of knives and swords which were kind of like this. Perhaps a bit like the Dacian falx was single-edged, although that was a very curved blade. It was almost like an oversized sickle, and very much a large fighting weapon. It means you could still find a knife-sized version of a similar type of blade. Again, this is starting to head into conjecture and guesswork, because Romans didn't really bother talking about the barbarians without disparaging them or just saying they were inferior, or of course describing the amazing ways in which we won over the savages. Wankers. Yeah, it's hard to find information on this, so unfortunately I can't really for sure say where the origins of these thick-spined, single-edged, forward-pointed blades came from, but it does seem like a general European thing to have a straight blade. So that's about as far as you can go. That's the thing, the earlier you go, the less information there is. Now, I've talked a lot about their origins. Now in terms of fighting with them, I'll talk about it in another video. Yes, that's what I'll do. So I shall see you in the next video. See you later.